Buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. After the lunch break, we needed to feed the soul and the body. We needed to feed the body as much as the soul. So now we have to keep on feeding our souls with the last speakers of today. This is the second day of this doctoral seminar of the Carlos Quintos European Award Cultural Roots of the Council of Europe, Culture, Heritage, History and Memory for the Promotion of European Values, Integration and Peace. And today's afternoon session is for Paula Albitre Lamata from the Complutense University of Madrid. She will be talking about languages as social pillars in migration, a study of Spanish as a tool for union and cooperation between people. She will be introduced by JESÚS BAIGORRI JALÓN, who told me not to talk about him very much, not to do a lengthy introduction, something which is quite difficult because we are close friends. We have been close friends for many years. He was at the origin, at the beginning of this seminar and this prize, since it was created. He was a professor of the Department of Translation and Interpretation of the University of Salamanca. He's now retired. He was an interpreter at the United Nations and a founding member of the Alfaqueque research group, author and editor of a dozen books on interpretation and translation and numerous articles. So having Professor BAIGORRI here today, again, in person, because in last seminar he couldn't make it here because of the pandemic, is an honor. It's an honor. So thank you, JESÚS. I was a bit lengthy, but I needed to. Thank you. You have the floor. You have the number 2.
Introduction, and I'm going to quote the director of the foundation, who's here, just to say that as he mentioned yesterday, starting at 3:15 is either a sin or I don't know what here in Spain, but in any case, it is our job and it is our turn to be here. I am quite awake, and I'm sure that Paula will also be very awake. I have the pleasure of introducing Paula Albitre Lamata, who teaches at the University Complutense in Madrid, and she's going to speak of languages as social pillars in migration, a study of Spanish as a tool for union and cooperation between peoples. I wish simply to underscore a couple of things. One, that she speaks of languages as tools. They also can be weapons, and they are weapons on many occasions. And I know that she's going to speak about how to teach Spanish as a foreign language to those who come to Spain, either as asylum seekers or as immigrants, regular immigrants in general. But I know, because we have discussed this and because it's also on her paper, that she will focus on the Ukrainian group of immigrants that have been admitted due to the invasion of the Ukraine by the Russian troops only a year and a half ago, and how they should be handled, in her opinion, regarding the teaching of the local language, etc. This brings me, and this is, I conclude like this, this brings me to a very remote history. In 1937, two of my cousins, who were 20 years older than me, left Bilbao as children of the war, as refugees, to live with foster families, one of them in France, the other one in Belgium. Perhaps some of those in front of me do not know that around 50,000 children left Spain during the war just to be relieved from the sufferings of the war. Many of them were to France, others to Belgium, Great Britain, and a good deal of them to the Soviet Union, which will bring me later on probably to a comment regarding this idea of living in a totally different country and totally separated, severed relations, etc., with the West, not just during the Spanish Civil War, but later on during the Second World War and during the Cold War. The floor is all yours, Paula. I invite you to go to the lectern and start when you want. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, espero que se me escuche bien. En primer lugar, me gustaría comenzar agradeciendo.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Professor BAIGORRI for your kind introduction. It is a pleasure for me. I would also like to start by thanking the Yuste Foundation not only for organizing this seminar, but also for the impeccable work they do in promoting and supporting work, PhD students, as PhD students, and also for master's degree students. I was here 4 years ago. Well, I was in Guadalupe when I was a master student, and it is. I'm very thankful because it's a lonely world, those of academics. So having of academicians, I mean, and so having the support of these kind of organizations and institutions is of great help. So I hope more institutions will follow your steps. My communication, my paper is a little bit different of those that have been presented so far because it's a completely different field, even if it fits into the cultural roots and the migration roots that accompany Javier mentioned this morning. But I'm not going to talk about them from a social or political perspective. I'm going to talk about them from a linguistic point of view, from a language point of view. Those of us who care about solidarity, group solidarity, values of the European Union, wonder sometimes how to consolidate those values. How can we contribute to consolidating them? And maybe my scope or my actions are limited because I'm not a politician, I don't work on politics, but as a linguist I try to do what I can. My work started a few years ago, and some of the data date back from a few years ago, but as you can imagine, a year and a few months ago, everything changed with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So I have adapted it and modified it to the current situation, to the current state of affairs. I have structured my presentation in two sections. In the first one, I will talk about theories. This is the theoretical block, and I'm going to start with an introduction because linguistics can be something foreign for some of you. So I will start talking about the teaching of foreign languages and the current state of affairs. I try to analyze materials and handbooks that are available for teachers of foreign languages and second languages, and some materials proposed or published by some regions and some governments and the European Union. I will also talk about the corpus linguistics and how it can be used in a useful way for the teaching of foreign languages. That is what I called LELE. That means teaching of foreign languages. And so the underlying interest of all of us is to go beyond our papers. I mean, finding the practical application of our research. So I will then talk about the practical applications in students, refugees, literate or illiterate, because we want to see how to design materials that are useful for them so that we can make them easier for them to learn a second language and to integrate in the community, in their host community, in their host country. And we finally integrate both the theoretical and the practical parts in the conclusions. So when I was planning this research was way before the Ukraine war, when I was doing the master's degree on Spanish as a foreign language. I started to think about how I could help people in risk of exclusion, such as refugees that are sometimes illiterate. That is like the second obstacle for them to integrate in the society. So I cannot talk in a personal way because I have never lived something like that, but I imagine it has to be an ordeal for them. They had to flee their home countries, and not just that, they are forced to learn a foreign language. You can see these pieces of news in some of the media in Spain. Most of the Ukrainian refugees said that Spanish, which is mother tongue for some of you, was an obstacle, a barrier. And I was wondering, how can we, linguists, philologists, foreign language teachers, make this easier for them and remove this obstacle, the language barriers, because life is hard enough for them as it is, and language is a harder obstacle. So let's turn languages into a cooperation or a facilitation, because that is our objective. We want to make it easier for vulnerable people and people in risk of exclusion to learn Spanish in an easier way. People both coming from inside and outside of the European Union, because you know that we have refugees from many other countries, not just Ukraine. And, well, these are the objectives. We have analyzed the specific situation of these migrants, the target students. Then we wanted to create an innovative model specifically designed for this type of migrants. We also wanted to study and analyze the methodology that has been used so far in order to try and create a model with a focus and an emphasis on the communication skills and the social and pragmatic linguistic features. And at the same time, we wanted to include new technologies, such as, for example, the use of corpora, artificial intelligence, even if I haven't been able to integrate it for obvious reasons because it moves very fast and I haven't been able to keep up with it. And we try to adapt all of this to our target group, aka the refugees. We use a double methodology. So we're following a double methodology. We have a practical and a theoretical methodology because we are studying both language policies and handbooks that are available now for Spanish as a foreign language teaching. They are not specialized in this kind of target students. But there's also a practical way of looking at it because we have defined special materials for this type of students. So this research is part of a project that takes more things into account, not just teaching of Spanish as a foreign language. In the whole project, there are other subjects such as, for example, history, social and pragmatic issues, how speakers take many things into account, more than linguistics. We take into account contexts and many more things. For example, ideology, social context, and the cultural context. And I think, well, I think Enrique is not here today, but I wanted to talk about the distance between the meaning of a term and the signifier, the meaning and the signifier. There are two different things. The significant, or the meaning, the sense, and the signifier. And this is something we linguists take into account. Well, let's focus on the teaching of Spanish as a foreign language. When we talk about language teaching, we certainly think of syntax, morphology, vocabulary, verb tenses, because we have learned, or most of us have learned a foreign language, and we have taken English or French or Spanish lessons. But languages are much more than linguistic elements. It is a construct, so it is much more than morphology or grammar or a syntax. Because when teaching a language, we talk about solidarity, equality, tolerance. So it is a meaning to transmit, to convey an essential value, which is peace, and especially for this type of target students. This discipline was born in 1960s in the United States when a group of soldiers that had immigrated to Europe needed to learn a language, a second language, because they were living in a territory where their mother tongue was not spoken. So they needed a language to communicate, to go shopping, or to do things in their daily lives. But you can imagine that as a social activity, language teaching or language learning has been present since the beginning of life on Earth, because people have traveled and traded, etc. But coming back to our students, we have a very heterogeneous groups of students. Some of them see language learning as an obligation, as something compulsory. Some others see it as a leisure activity. As you can imagine, we sometimes learn the language just for fun or because we wanted to. These people have to learn a language because they have fled their countries of origin. I want to say something which is very relevant, the basic distinction of foreign language teaching. According to Instituto Cervantes, several hundreds of millions of people speak Spanish as a as their mother tongue, but it is double or triple that number if we take into account people who speak Spanish in their daily lives, even if in combination with other languages. That explains the political power of the Spanish language and why we need to understand how to better teach our language. And we need to understand these terms. The mother tongue, the native language, well, mother tongue is a convention. It doesn't have to be the language of our mothers. It can be the language of our father. And the target language or the second language is the language we learn in a second time. But we tend to differentiate between foreign language and second language. For example, foreign language is any foreign language that is not a mother tongue, but the foreign language, well, that is a foreign language. A second language is in the case of regions or countries with two official languages. Well, the second language is the second official language, not our mother tongue. We also have to differentiate between acquisition and learning. They're different. Acquisition is what we do as babies. We acquire, we start speaking a language just by imitation in a natural way. However, when we take lessons, we are learning a language. We're not acquiring it. It depends on whether the learning is reflexive or not. We also have to learn these terms: bilingual teaching and L2 teaching. In Spain, most schools and high schools are bilingual, or so to say, bilingual. That means that you're not really learning the language in itself. You're being taught in two languages. Okay? However, in the teaching of a second language, the teaching of the second language is the second language itself. So only the second language is taught in that language. The rest of subjects are taught in the first language. We can also talk about communication skills. That is the skill or the ability or the possibility we have to communicate in a certain environment or in certain settings once we have learned a language. We have to follow the rules, the grammar, syntax, and vocabulary rules, and social rules. And that is really complicated because they're not stereotypes, even if sometimes we think they are stereotypes. And I would like to highlight the rule of of the Council of Europe, which cares about the citizens' rights, in this case, language rights. If we talk about communication skills, how can you tell whether someone has communication skills? For the Council of Europe, you have to have a threshold level. That is the minimum level you need to have if you want to communicate properly. I think you're all familiar with all the levels A1, A2, B1, B2, etc. I'm sure some of you have taken exams to certify your language level, your competence in languages. But now communication skills take into account broader sets of traits, because we're not just dictionaries. Our language production depends on many things. For example, our colleagues from Cartagena or Colombia, even if they speak Spanish, their Spanish is different because they also come from a different setting, a different context or background. So Canale and Swain in 1980 set out a skill model, a communication skill model, composed of the grammar skills, social and language skills, and the strategic skills. Then Beckman in 1990 proposed a different model, organization skills, pragmatic skills, and then we had the CEFR, the Common European Framework Reference for Languages in 2001 that broadened it and proposed a completely different model. This is the one that we use now when we talk. We take into account many different elements. Some of them we are aware of, some of them we are completely unaware, but they condition us in the way we speak. We also have to take into account interculturality, which means taking into account factors, cultural factors and histories. And normally people who study Spanish as a foreign language are very heterogeneous. They form a very heterogeneous group, so they come from different backgrounds and contexts. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to be aware of the fact that the target students have a different culture from his or her own. So there might be mistakes or interferences due to cultural problems. So we want to remove those barriers in case of mistakes or misunderstandings or whatever. Teachers are aware of the cultural component so that they can overcome them. How can we do that? For teachers, we can perform a very detailed analysis of the students' profiles. That's why teachers aren't just teachers, they are facilitators, intercultural mediators. They need to facilitate that transmission of culture, and they have to try and integrate everybody in the classroom. And for that, we need to talk about cultural elements in the classroom, not to create a cultural clash, a cultural shock. No, just the opposite. It is right the contrary. Quite the contrary, because that way the students will be able to integrate as much as possible in a new communication setting. This is the end of the theoretical section. Let me finish by saying that I have used 3 handbooks for this research. We'll talk about verbal courtesy, which is one of the most problematic issues in the teaching of foreign languages, because courtesy is, as you can imagine, a set of rules, a set of conventions, but it is not a closed list, and it is not something that is easy to be explained. Think about something, for example, think about the person you have to your right or to your left. How could you ask him or her to fill your glass of water? You might wonder, how would you say it? Maybe, you would use the formal tone or informal tone, or maybe instead of a question, you would say, you would express it as a wish. I'm thirsty, I would like to have a glass of water, or a question. Can I have a glass of water? Could I have a glass of water? Or please, can you pass me the water? Or maybe with gestures. And imagine this is a glass of water, but imagine if you're asking for money or something else. So there is a lot of conditionings. Your age, persons next to you, the language you use, the setting, or whatever. And people from America would be using, I'm sure, many different strategies because they have a completely different language and social and cultural variables. And we linguists try to understand and explain all these to every student in a classroom. So imagine if the students are refugees who are dealing with so many things at the same time. So as I was saying, I have analyzed the verbal courtesy patterns in some handbooks. In the Common European Framework of Reference, in the PSIC, which is a specific framework created by Instituto Cervantes, and I have analyzed 3 different handbooks by different publishing houses, Difusión, Enclave L, and Santillana. So I have analyzed them. They are both for B2 level. They are for general purposes, for general students. They're not specific for any specific setting, and my goal is not to criticize these handbooks. They're perfectly valid. But some of them are better or better suited for some student groups than for others. This is a semi-open structure. We have sampled exercises in the materials, similar types of exercises, and we have discarded 2 restrictive exercises. So we have included all these exercises in the same set of sentences. As you can see, we have analyzed 110 statements. And you can see the role of interculturality, which is not significant in an intercultural way. Sorry, 108 statements. So, as I was saying, we have analyzed many different statements, expressive statements, directive statements, imposing, non-imposing, intercultural statements, non-verbal communication statements, assertive statements, attenuation statements, interruptions, etc. Interruption statements. And as you can imagine, these exercises are adapted to the theoretical items that had been discussed previously. And now I will talk about the conclusions. The exercises take into account social measures and effective measures, and those that were intended to interrupt or to invite are very scarce. And we have performed a double analysis of the directive statements, and they take into account intercultural settings. I need to talk about corpora, the use of corpora. I will be talking about Cordes, Crea, and Corpus 21, proposed by RAE, the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language, and the use of corpora is very useful for us teachers and students to go deeper in the communication skills.
Es verdad que tiene que...
The role of the teacher needs to change. They need to go beyond their traditional role. They need to take an active role and become intercultural mediators, promoting, boosting the students' skills. Now we move on to a more hands-on approach, and I'll be focusing on the refugees' situation. For refugee, we can find different definitions, and I have brought the one from the Geneva Convention, understanding a refugee as a person that is a person who fears, reading the definition of the Geneva Convention. In other words, a refugee is different from a migrant that learns a second language. Is the fact that a migrant is leaving their country of origin voluntarily, and a refugee is fleeing the country for several reasons. I have very little, almost no legal knowledge, so please do apologize if I make any mistakes. But the Spanish legislation understands a refugee as a person who needs to flee a place and escape from it. And the role of Spanish teaching to refugees, I would like to underline the role of Margarita Isabel Asensio. It is essential because she promoted this type of studies. The social-linguistic profile of the groups in risk of exclusion made up by refugees is conditioned by special features. The displacement is not usually voluntary, so there is no free voluntary return, so it is needed to welcome. It's necessary to welcome these people in their host countries, and we need to take into account post-traumatic stress situation and the Ulysses syndrome due to the mobilization necessary due to war or disadvantaged situations in certain regions. I would like to highlight that every migration movement are related to stress situations, but refugee migrations or refugees movements have even more stress, and that conditions teaching to these groups. Among the factors we need to take into account when we prepare our classes are the following. First of all, age. It is different teaching to children and to adults. Adriana said earlier today that children, even if it's hard to say that, children might not have concerns that adults have, and they might be able to acquire a second language more easily. Sex. It's been said earlier today that women do not have the opportunity to access to learning a second language, and the origin. If you are from Ukraine or from Italy, your way to learn Spanish will be different. Among the Ukrainian refugees, we can speak of a homogeneous group, and within it there are different ages and different education levels, and this group has some homogeneous circumstances and features because they have come due to the same problem, which is the current war that's taking place in the country. I'd like to highlight the role of the European Union because it promotes very actively different educational opportunities, personally, at the personal level, because it opens opportunity to companies, because if workers can learn the language, they have more opportunities to learn, to grow in international markets, and also there are social factors. The Spanish situation is very peculiar. As you can see here, in the past years, the increase of refugee demand has risen. As you can see, many of them come from a Spanish-speaking country, so teaching Spanish was not that's important in teaching refugees because they already spoke Spanish as their mother tongue. But Spain is the third country after Spain and after France and Germany in requests from refugees. And finally, they do not get that many. They are only the third country from the back. In Spain, among the linguistic policies, there is not a common policy as such, but there are other organs or bodies such as the refugee welcome centers, focusing more on social benefits. There are no national policies, but there are regional policies specific to this situation. And the Ukrainian situation, unfortunately, meant a turning point. Up until February 2022, most of the refugees coming spoke Spanish as a mother tongue, although there are cases of Arab-speaking people and others, and the war triggered the need for special programs to teach Spanish to these people. The Extremadura regional government has developed a program called Accompanying Spain, Accompanying Ukraine. There is a digital library, and the teachers can upload their own materials, teaching materials, to facilitate learning to these refugees. And also the Ministry of Social Inclusion and Migrations has developed the Ukraine Urgent Program for this very same purpose. And finally, the Instituto Cervantes Institute has done a convention with the Red Cross for this type of for the Spanish teaching since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, we can see that the gender distribution split up is quite egalitarian. Broken up by regions in Spain, most of them has requested asylum, are seeking asylum in Valencia and Madrid. Also, Extremadura had played an important role, 743 permits have been granted, and these data are very important because Spain is placed among the European countries that's granted more permits to the Ukrainian population. The Instituto Cervantes Institute has a pioneering program with 6,500 free permits to promote and facilitate teaching of Spanish. The European Commission has also developed a number of fundamental policies that are supporting both the teachers and also the target students conditioned by this situation, and they're promoting solidarity and encouraging peace from the linguistic policies. Pictograms or picture charts have been made to bring the target language closer to this population, the refugees population. And finally, a more practical approach. I'm going to present the steps followed, and from this social linguistic refugee profile, I'm going to try and promote their integration in the Spanish society. The first thing we need to do is to analyze the situation of each group of students, and we need to try and integrate them in the target community. It has to be mixed groups. If we only had refugees groups, we could be creating silos or ghettos. We consider that we don't need to change the curriculum in depth, but they need to be adapted to this type of target students and adapt our existing materials to the teaching in this type of context. And finally, it is very important to have emotional, psychological, and other types of support, not just teachings. On top of that, I think that it's essential to offer specialized training for Spanish, for the teachers of Spanish, not because we can speak Spanish as a mother tongue and have our diploma. Are we able to teach appropriately this target population? We need to have extra knowledge and more support to be well aware of the situation. We need to find materials and activities adapted to this type of target students. Not all the students are the same. The groups are not homogeneous. And we need to adapt to prevent problems and cultural clashes. If we choose to adapt materials instead of creating new ones, we need to avoid hurtful or humiliating materials, and we need to mention cultural aspects as well. We need to take into account cultural, linguistic needs and non-linguistic needs. We need to understand that as teachers, we are facilitators. We're not just mentors. We are cultural mediators among different cultures. We need to go beyond communication to try and comprise much more with activities that take into account deductive methods, such as using the linguistic corpuses included in our activities, and also to try and achieve more integration through communication skills. What have we taken into account to design these activities? 3 things. Teaching focuses on individuals. It is not the teacher anymore. It is not their activities. What counts is students are the core of what we do. Language is more than words, morphology, and syntax. It is a way to interact. And like I said before, we don't need to rule out the materials we already have. All the materials we've seen before, the materials can be improved, but it would be more convenient and faster, and we can improve it if we adapt and design the curriculum, not from the scratch, but to modify what we have to the target students. Students with an ability, with special abilities, special skills, and special emotional situations. And Spanish is a tool, is a successful tool for integration in the target population or welcome host population, because it facilitates their access to society, to education, to the work market, and the civic and cultural participation. It allows for refugees not just to get communication skills, linguistic skills, but it also promotes their integration and the constitution of the intercultural, meaningful intercultural reactions. And I go back to one of the first slides. Teaching a language is not just that, it is to promote social integration and also to promote different values. And as teachers, we need to be well aware of that, of our activities. We are not just communicators, we are also some kind of integrators into the culture we are. Final conclusions. I believe that the activities designs that could not be presented here today because we didn't have the time, but they have been made, and the main goal was to reduce, and we've achieved this, to reduce exclusion situation and equality situations in terms of culture and language for these vulnerable groups, thanks to the better knowledge of the Spanish language and culture. Innovative materials in Spanish have been created for Ukrainian refugees, and they could be applied to teaching other languages in the EU. And I would like to complete to keep on working on teaching Spanish, but not Spanish from Spain. Let's not forget that the Spanish from here has different features, and we should prepare materials with different from different settings. They could be uploaded in platforms and also be used in some ongoing programs, and they could be very helpful to facilitate learning of many refugees, and also to facilitate the training of people or the training of teachers who want to specialize in teaching Spanish to refugees. Like I said before, this is an essential thing that it's sometimes neglected. The Ukrainian situation has highlighted this, and that's the situation. I think this has allowed us to find out more about the different EU policies. The Charter of Rights acknowledges multilingualism as one of its values because it allows the citizens to communicate in their own language and protect the linguistic diversity of Europe as one of its founding principles, and to promote learning in Europe. In Europe, there are currently 24 official languages plus other 60 languages, not just the co-official languages such as the Galician, Basque and Catalan, but many other languages from people living here, such as Chinese and other languages. The European Union is trying to promote the development of the linguistic diversity because it allows to promote the development of the linguistic industry. And I would like to thank our three interpreters, the one we have here, Juan, Nadia and Carlos, for their work, because they are facilitating and enabling cultural linguistic diversity in our seminar. And in the end, the linguistic diversity, like I wanted to say in the end, is an essential component of culture and intercultural dialogue. And the role of languages, like I tried to say before, languages cannot be a barrier, cannot be they cannot be a barrier. They have to be a link and a way to cooperate among different peoples. And in the end, we all deserve, we all have the right to have a training and employment and a dignified life, regardless of our places of origin. It is, I guess this is a very difficult situation. I haven't experienced this myself, but leaving your country, not being able to go back and finding these barriers must be very harsh. So the duty of philologists, linguists and Spanish teachers as a second language, our duty is to give a hand, to reach out for others and try to create new activities, new models that can facilitate and support education. I would like to finish by referring to the routes or to the roads and itineraries we've been discussing. And these are some verse. This is a poem by Machado saying that walker, there is no road. You walk your road as you walk along. These are some very famous verses, and I believe that all my colleagues and myself are very proud, and we will humbly try to walk on and keep helping to promote peace and consolidate the situation in the European Union and the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula, for your presentation, which has been very coherent and very fast. You were grateful to the interpreters, and you should.
Hablo muy rápido, lo siento.
I speak very fast, I'm sorry about that.
Albitre, do you know what that means?
No.
From Arabic?
Sí, es... bueno, te voy a contestar
Veterinary.
Sé que Albitre, mi ascendencia era árabe. Bueno, yo soy de la zona de la...
I have Arab ascendancy, and we have, I think we all have Arab features in my family, and palpitre, that word is Arab for...
As if they were pets, but with a knowledgeable capacity of knowing the trade. So that's the first thing to congratulate you, and also to make you aware of the meaning of your surname. I see you more, I mean, in the succession of roles that you may take on as someone working between two languages. You're not a conduit, you're a bit of a clarifier, a culture clarifier, a bit of a culture broker, but above all, you're an advocate.
Sí.
You're an advocate. I mean, you put your heart in what you're doing and trying to teach these people who are in situation of disadvantage, and it shows. I mean, it is clearly visible throughout your paper and your presentation. Teaching the language and designing materials makes you someone who's not talking from the ivory tower of the university, but rather hands-on and on the terrain, in the field. And that is a way to congratulate you in that sense. I wish to make a couple of comments that perhaps have gone, issues that have gone unnoticed to you. One of them has to do with what I mentioned at the beginning regarding my cousins living abroad. One of them stayed in France forever, and he became a Catholic father and stayed there forever. The other one returned to Spain, and he knew he had learned French. I mean, the first writing traces of his childhood were in French. I mean, I've seen his notebooks were in French, not in Spanish. But actually, the time factor means that 20 years later, or 25 years later, what was a hindrance perhaps for their integration becomes a great asset for their professional development. Talking about the children who went to the Soviet Union from Spain, they went with teachers that accompanied them, Spanish teachers, but once their knowledge ended, that's when they arrived at the age of secondary school, they went to Russian schools. So they learned Russian, and they became Hispano-Soviéticos, the Hispano-Soviets in Russia. In 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba where Castro won. And he started receiving Soviet advisors, military and from other branches too. And the problem was how to communicate with the Cubans. The Spanish children, who were no longer children, but rather adults, were the ones who were called to play the role of mediators, of interpreters for the Russians, between the Russians and the Cubans. So that's something that should not be lost sight of. I mean, when they come here, I mean, these Ukrainians, who, by the way, are a mixture, because there are also Africans who are living in the Ukraine and people from other countries, plus they are not necessarily monolingual of the Ukrainian language, but many of them are Russian speakers as a mother tongue. I mean, that's a fact. So they can keep their language, and it's good that they keep their language. And if they learn Spanish, they will have an excellent opportunity of using that ability to practice both languages and to play the role of mediators. Another issue which is quite important, new technologies. At the beginning, when the Ukrainian children began to arrive in Spain, I remember that some of them were still attending a school through Zoom with their schools back in the Ukraine. That is something unheard of for instance, in other wars or in other situations of exile, in this sense. This is quite important. First, because they can keep their education in the original language, at least for some time, and that would not have happened without the technologies we have right now. They can also communicate with their families, they can keep their links and their relations with people back in their country. Interculturality. I'm going to tell you a joke, if I'm allowed to do that. There is this interfaith and interreligion conference, and at the end of the session, much as we have experienced half an hour or so ago, waiters come with the, with the trays full of food, etc. And the situation is that the Catholic father happens to be close to the rabbi. And one of the trays comes full of ham, beautiful ham. The Catholic father tells the rabbi, "Why do you reject this beautiful ham? When are you going to stop with this ridiculous habit?" The answer of the rabbi, "At your wedding, father, at your wedding." So that's a way to tell what interculturality means. And that is quite important, because from eating hours to, I mean, you name it, I mean, proxemics. Probably for a Ukrainian to be touched or to be spoken from this distance, is something strange. For us in Spain, that's quite normal. To be touched, to hug someone who is not, or to kiss someone who's, an alien to a certain extent, there's no problem with that. But probably for these people, and I'm talking of proxemics as just one of the things, but obviously there are many other habits that should be sort of pruned or sorted out anyway. Another point, there has to be a pull factor sufficiently strong for them to be keen on learning the language. There may be some who are considering that they're going to go back to the Ukraine in no time, that the war is going to end and that they don't need to make the effort, physical and mental, effort of learning a language. So they may not be that interested in learning the language. But besides, I mean, if we have in Spain the model, the sort of bilingual model in some schools, no one thinks of what other bilinguality can be except for the regional local languages, but English and Spanish. So perhaps in the geopolitics of languages, they think, well, Spanish is okay, but maybe if I learn English, I will be better off down the road to be able to go elsewhere, etc. And for them, for some of them anyway, this will be considered as a transit country, perhaps trying to join relatives who migrated to the US or whatever. This is a point that has to be taken into account and perhaps mentioned. I don't mean that you have to go in depth into this research, but I think this is something that should be considered. In that sense, I want to quote one of the members of the Academy of Yuste, Abraham Desvan, who has a great book, who was published some time ago in 2001, but which continues to be valid in some of the points he makes. It is entitled Words of the World, and it makes like a geopolitical constellation of languages where the hypercentral language is English. Then there are some supercentral languages, French, Spanish, German, etc., and then less central languages. I'm not going to mention any of them, but anyway, what I mean is that there is like a cascade of centrality in terms of the language, and this is quite interesting because you will be able to find some good ideas probably regarding the geopolitics of languages as well. You were talking of the Spanish language that is being taught here, and it should be, obviously, because it's the closest option, Spanish from Spain. But as an Argentinian writer, Andrés Neumann, says, el español es un idioma que le queda grande a España.
Spanish is a language.
So we should think, and since we have Camilo here, I thought that perhaps you were saying perhaps Camilo or Laura wouldn't understand exactly what I was thinking that Camilo would have been kind enough downstairs to ask me, ¿le provoca un tintico a su merced? Perhaps none of you will understand that tintico or tinto in Colombia means a coffee, black coffee, not a red wine. but I mean, this tells you something about how rich the language is in this sense, and how careful we should be regarding what we teach and what we learn. Finally, because I don't want to give a lecture here, I'm simply making big brush strokes of what your presentation and your paper suggested to me. I'm finishing with asking you to think of this famous painting by Magritte, Ceci n'est pas une pipe. The pipe, ceci n'est pas une pipe. What I say is that when we are seeing how many migrants are being drowned in the Mediterranean, how many people are not being admitted, you have said how many were rejected their asylum form, actually, you know, their form, yeah, the application form. When we see all those things, what I say is that seeing that Europe is ceci n'est pas l'Europe que je voudrais, en tout cas. This is not the Europe I would like to see. Thank you. Now.
Muchas gracias, Jesús.
Sí, pues muchas gracias. Si quieres reaccionar y
Sí.
ya veo algunas.
Thank you very much. Would you like to react? Yes, I would like to thank Jesus for his wonderful words. I think I will be able to improve much with my paper. I wanted to mention, but I didn't really have the time, I wanted to mention the children of war, those who went to Russia. I think that's one of the cases that are not very well known in Spain. It's children from northern Spain, the Basque country, Navarra, who also had to flee as refugees. And that's also very shocking because Spain was moved from being one of the countries that, from where a country with lots of refugees leaving the country, and it moved from there to getting lots of refugees in. And the role of interculturality is very interesting. Interruption. We speakers interrupt each other all the time. Spanish speakers interrupt each other. And in other cultures, interrupting each other is very unpolite. And the more we interrupt each other, the better. We seem to be understanding each other better. It seems that we are exchanging more. And in other cultures, that's different, and that's a cultural clash. And that's something we need to overcome when we teach. Being interested in learning, that's also something I wanted to mention. Wanting to learn English to improve your work conditions, for instance. There are some refugees who left the country because they had to, and they do not have the possibility to go back, or they have ruled it out. Or those who were forced to leave with much pain and willing to go back. That's the second group of refugees that are probably the most reluctant to learn the second language, Spanish, English, French, or whatever it is, because it might appear for them a way to drift away from the culture. So thank you very much for your contribution, your thoughts, and your feedback.
Yo añadiría eso de.
Thank you, Paula. And I have to add something to what you said about the interruption. We also tend to not to finish our sentences, and we take for granted that the person listening to us will complete what I don't say. Well, congratulations. And I want to take the occasion to say something about my personal life. I was born under a dictatorship, and until I was 8. It was Christmas time in Romania, and I remember myself and my mother looking for balloons, Christmas balloons, under the revolution, and we were scared when we passed before in front of soldiers with their weapons, and it's the only image I have from the dictatorship. And sometimes that's the reason I think all my works talk about acknowledgement and appreciation. I'm really thankful for everything. I think children never choose to migrate. It's their parents who choose for them. When I came to Spain, I was already almost grown up. I wasn't a child anymore. They have asked me to hold the microphone like this. I wanted to say that children are not part of the decision-making process, but they have an extraordinary resilience because they have the individual responsibility to overcome their conditions, as opposed to the children who are born here. And when you were talking about adaptation to the host culture, you need to take into account the cultural associations because they manage the culture of the people coming from these countries, and they can organize many practical things, many activities around languages and around the refugees. But the impact is not only on the children who come, the refugee children. The impact is also on the children here on the host schools because they are impacted also by the coming of refugees to their classrooms. Professor Fernandez Daza, you have the floor. I just want to make a very, very short comment after congratulating you, of course. I was closely following it with much detail. I was all the time thinking about the 16th century. There was a person from Extremadura, Benito Arias González, from a village called Fregenal. He used to speak many languages. And in 1570, he decided to launch a chair for Spanish teaching in Louvain, at the University of Louvain. It was the times of the Protestants and Martin Luther. And everyone thought he was crazy. But it's linked to what you said. A language is much more than a religion or a nation or a country or an empire. A language for them is a vehicle for all the toils and businesses and for public things, as he used to say in his old-time Spanish. And it is true still now. If you want to travel, if you want to set up a business, and especially if you go to America. And you talked about intercultural mediations, and this person, he went to Ghent, he went to Belgium, and he could have used Spanish there at that time, or French, or English, but he said, no, I want to learn the language that is spoken here, but because I want to make friends here. And language learning the language is the best way for me to make friends with them. Dialogue, conversations revolve around a common language. And I was thinking about this when you were talking about that cultural mediation. It looks so far away, the 16th century, but this person was already, he was making reflections about all that. Thank you, Professor Fernandez Dazana Milosevic.
Really brilliant presentation. My compliments to you. It's one of those presentations that kind of like put a scientific light to my personal life, to my personal situation in some kind of way, kind of scientifically explain the things that I have witnessed or seen. I also happen to speak several languages, some of necessity, some by choice. So it's really a brilliant presentation. I just want to make two really brief comments regarding the languages as a social pillar, as you said in your the beginning of your presentation. So the first one is that you make reference clearly because you're tackling the issue of Ukrainian refugees in Spain, and you speak in terms of integration. And this is something really not novel in Spanish history. So because I remember in the 1990s that there were a lot of children, a lot of families from Bosnia that fled the war in the 1990s Yugoslavia, and they came to Barcelona. So this is one of those models, although very localized on local level in Barcelona, that maybe can be an example of success, I think, in teaching these people a new language skills. And I also want to emphasize, and I think this is much more important than integration per se, because as JESÚS rightfully said and others, integration is maybe sometimes a matter of temporality. It can be it is not a permanent project. It's not set in stone. It can be really, really temporary. But learning a new language sometimes is a matter of survival. And this is something that needs to be quite emphasized in, I think, an example of Ukrainian children, Ukrainian people coming to fleeing the war, but also in other situations. I happen to have interviewed a young girl whose father was brutally hurt in a Toja station in 2004, terrorist attacks in Madrid. And he is a Moroccan. And in the attacks, he completely lost his memory. He is still in hospital in very terrible conditions. And his family was in Morocco. So when they found him and they brought him to the hospital, and clearly he could not respond, they identified him, they clearly contacted his family, and his family in 24 hours had to come from Morocco to Spain. 11-year-old daughter and with the mother, without actually knowing one word of Spanish. So for them, learning Spanish, this is what the daughter told me actually, was a matter of survival. It was a matter of dealing with legal issues, understanding the rights, learning the language in the same manner, dealing with the matters of health and with the survival of their father and the survival of their family. So I think survival is also something that maybe you should kind of take into account, not only integration. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ana. ¿Quieres hacer alguna reacción?
Thank you, Ana. Paula. Or anything else? Anyone else, sorry, who wants to intervene after? Paula, sorry, microphone. Yes, of course. More than just a need, it's a matter of survival. I think the anecdote or the story you've told about the victim of the terrorist attacks of 2004 in Madrid illustrates that a language is sometimes a barrier that sets you apart and that separates, that does life and death apart. And languages can be a barrier instead of a nexus or a link in most cases. I have talked about the Ukraine war because it is the hot topic now, and because we are proud of how everything has been prepared and organized in a very fast way to try and make this and make life easier for all the refugees, all the mechanisms, all the language teaching programs, etc. So it is really overwhelming to see how many people have worked towards the creation of those specific mechanisms for refugees. And as Carmen said, some people were already sensitive to this type of issues in the 16th century. Spanish was also part of the weapons of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, because you know that Spain was spoken in many different places at the time because we were an empire. And we have found Spanish teaching handbooks published in the 17th and the 18th century. They were used by people who happen to speak several languages, who cared about teaching Spanish to other people, because the need for people to learn Spanish was there, and people were happy to teach Spanish to other people. So we think this is something very new, and it isn't. So when I met my colleague Andrea a few days ago, I knew that she will feel very touched and emotional about all this story, because as you know now, she's an activist. She's not a linguist, but she's an activist in all the Romanian issues in Seville. So I knew that she was going to be deeply moved by this, because language and cultural diversity is not only for the people who come to our country, it's for everyone. And it is true that children never choose to flee, they never choose to become refugees. They are victims, or they are affected by it nonetheless. So we have to focus on children if we are to facilitate their integration. Thank you. One more intervention, Professor Freixas. I just wanted to congratulate you on your work. You said that in the European Union, language diversity is a value that needs to be preserved. Though it's very complicated from the point of view of the existence of the official languages and the minority languages and regional languages. I don't know if you've taken it into account. Have you taken into account the European Chart on Language, on Minority and Regional Languages, published by the Council of Europe? Because it contains many ideas on the protection of mother tongues, on the situation of children and languages in education, the administration, and there is also a very large case law and judgments on the European Court on children, cases about children, on imposition of languages, and forcing them to learn specific languages and things like that. Yes, it is true that I have paid more attention to official languages because I focused my research on Spanish, but I would take a look at that chart. You're right. There are languages that are official in their countries, even if they're not considered to be official languages in the European Union. I'm talking about Basque, Galician, etc. There are official languages in Spain, but not in the European Union. And it is true that children should be given the choice to learn the languages they need or they prefer, even if they're not official in the European Union. It's part of our heritage, of our family situation, culture, values, principles, etc. I will have it in checkout, of course, Teresa. Thank you. Estefania. Paula, congratulations, because I share many of your values and your work. I remember that in Poland, in the 50s and the 60s, there is a person, Wisława Szymborska, Aranza Asensky, who have won several prizes, the Princesa de Asturias Prize and the Nobel Literature Prize. And Herbert, they use poetry to change the subject matters, to change everything, because they lived the Holocaust and they lived in the war. They lived during the war. Szymborska used language to deconstruct it in his poems. He's got a very beautiful poem about that, about the need for inclusion. It is called A Hunger Field near Kassel in Germany. And there's another poem about Vietnam, and it's like a deconstruction of the poem. Well, we cannot translate a poem. I'm sorry, but it's something like, woman, are you hungry? Are you hungry? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then they ask her, woman, are these your children? And she said, yes. So they are being recognized now, and they are being paid more attention as of now.
Follow up what she was saying regarding the experience that she was going through while listening to her from her personal point of view. I think she was lying a bit, because if we follow the idea of Ismail Kadare in Les Quatre Interprètes, nous sommes tous des traducteurs au Balkan. In the Balkan countries, they're all translators. I mean, it is such a crossroads that they speak all the languages, or they can understand all the languages. C'est pas vrai. C'est pas vrai. Well, I'm quoting this guy. No, but it reminded me of something that we have lived together also here in Yuste, well, in Yuste rather than here, with the courses of geriatrics that we used to follow. And I played the role of interpreter there with the Society of Geriatrics from Britain that came here, doctors that came here to teach, doctors and nurses from Extremadura, and I was interpreting both ways. And it was for about 3 or 4 years in a row. The more I was interpreting, the less I needed the doctors, because I knew what they were saying about geriatrics, because that's what was happening to me. So they were telling exactly what was happening to me, aging. So I didn't need the original speaker, because I could represent everything as it was going through my body and my mind. Many Ukrainians will be needed, I suppose, to teach in those programs. Because it's easy to say, we have to teach them Spanish. Yeah, but I mean, if you don't know Ukrainian, and there aren't that many Ukrainians here to teach, I mean, offhand. I mean, they will have to be brought probably from the Ukraine or from other countries, knowing Spanish in order to be teachers, so that they can mediate. But I want to conclude with just an important thought. in the absence of language knowledge of the local language or the language you have to handle, seek an interpreter, seek a translator. Don't seek for ChatGPT or artificial intelligence, but real bodies, real people, who are the ones that can do the job. By the way, Charles V, who spent some time here, didn't need an interpreter because he spoke all the languages that he had to handle. He said that he spoke to his horse in German, no offense, Jürgen, that he spoke to his lovers in Italian, Spanish to God, etc. But I mean, other than that, he was a polyglot. That is worth, I think, underscoring it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jesús, y sobre todo.
Thank you very much, Jesus. And thank you for making this reference to Charles V, who brought us here. And I want to invite you to have a look at this speech, since you mentioned the ordeal of the Ukrainian refugees. Take a look or listen and watch the speech delivered by Lana Trihub on the occasion of the latest Charles V award ceremony on May the 9th here in Yuste, who gave us goosebumps because she used to have a perfect and happy life until the outbreak of the war. You can look for it on our website. We have made the most of the time we had, so Paula, thank you for your exposition. It was also a tribute to the two interpreters that are there in the booth and that have made this possible. Thank you.